In today's show, two American Fords from the 60s. First, we get smoochy with a car like Elvis once owned, or so it's said, but only for a very short period of time. And if you thought the new thing was niche marketing, currently of course all the rage with most European car makers, think again. We take a look at the first US production car actually to be saddled with the moniker of personal luxury car, and get away with it. Then later we meet the man who spent a lot of time, well, since 1991, restoring his car. Derek Noten even arranged all his holidays in the USA to track down parts, all shiny ones by the looks of it. Having turned down a straight swap with an XK8 convertible, Derek's not ever going to part with the car. But he tells us intends to leave it to his son one day. That is, if Dad'll ever stop driving it. So to our first car. Meet Brian Andrews, proud Thunderbird owner.
Right, this Thunderbird, 1962, also known as the Bullet Bird because of the shape. When this vehicle was made, 1962, remember space travel had just arrived on the scene. As a 390 big block Ford engine, FE engine is it called, with a 3-speed Cruiser-matic gearbox. This particular engine of mine has been taken out, rebuilt, rebored. Only thing I've done different, a new Edelbrock carburettor for better performance, more economical, with a chrome air filter to suit. But basically under the bonnet, everything as it was. So matching numbers, all the panels have never been taken off, all still got the stamps on them. When the vehicle was retrimmed a few years ago, when we took the back seats out, we found the original build sheet from the factory, date on it and when it was produced and what year. I think it was January the 1st, 1962.
But obviously, in the intervening years, this Thunderbird has had more than its fair share of love and attention, of which more later. But to put this particular model in context, Brian gives us a brief rundown of Thunderbirds from the first 10 years of production.
Well, the Ford Thunderbird was basically, the first one was a two-seater in 1955 to compete against the Chevrolet Corvette. Two-seater ran for approximately about 55 to 58, and then the public decided, and Ford wanted a slightly bigger vehicle, so they turned the Ford Thunderbird into a four-seater. At first, wasn't very popular with the public still wanted the two-seater sports car, but then it grew on people. The Thunderbird of the 50s was basically called, from 58 to 60 was the Square Bird. Then the third generation, which is this one, they called it the Rocket Bird because of space travel had just started. The rear lights on this resemble afterburners on a jet. This vehicle is a futuristic car because of the shape of it. Ford was also planning on the idea of the first car ever of Ford, a basically American car, to put a V8 transverse engine in. The engine was going to obviously the opposite way to everything before. But after the cost of tooling and so forth, they decided not to go ahead with it. Too expensive, so that went by the board. But another unique thing about this at the time, again first in the world I believe, it had the swing away steering wheel, which meant for easy access, you lifted the gear shift lever, and the steering wheel slid about 18 inches to the right. And again, unique with the suspension on this. As we know, most vehicle shock absorbers and rise up and down. The suspension on this vehicle goes up and down and forward and aft. They presume it would be a better, more comfortable ride. Tinted glass. The first vehicle again to have a rear view mirror that could shift from light to dark. Again, it's had electric windows, electric seats. I've had this vehicle 6 years. Typical barn find. The chap had bought it 12 months previously to restore, but he lost interest. The barn was full of military vehicles and his main hobby was military vehicles. But he bought this as a project, but after 12 months just threw a sheet over it and left it in a corner. Me and my son drove down to Shrewsbury, seen the vehicle, car was in good condition, fair condition should say, but all the way home kept stopping, starting, The fuel gauge didn't work, so we presumed no fuel. Kept putting more and more fuel in, but still, basically it was just the air filter was clogged up. We took off the air filter. Inside the air filter was numerous nests of mice and grass, so disregarded the air filter, got us home safely. I drove it for 2 or 3 months as it stood, then decided, I think the paint was very, very flat and chipped, so I decided to have a bare metal respray. Took all the paint off and painted in its original colour of Corinthian white, a Ford colour of the time. All the window rubbers, everything's renewed. Then, as we finished the painting, we decided a few weeks later, bad decision, to rebuild the engine. Took out the engine, rebuilt the engine, uprated it slightly, rebored it, obviously got more power. Then we decided go all the full hog, stainless steel exhaust through, or again, more power than it should have. Another thing I forgot to mention, the first thing I did when I bought the vehicle, first few weeks, was take the original hubcaps off, tin hubcaps on the wheels, and bought these American racing wheels, which I think suit the vehicle very well. Some people have 5-spoke wheels on classic cars, but this has still got the original drum brakes on, which work very good. But I decided these wheels suited the car. People say it does suit the car. That's basically the only thing that's not original on the vehicle. The seats was trimmed by a local chap in Warrington, basically, but he does VW camper vans, but I drove round, I found him. He was glad to trim my seats. People think it's leather, but it's not. It's a man-made product which is probably half vinyl and half leather. Seats was retrimmed, refoamed. Eventually, the door cards may need doing, but at the minute, the original one, the 50 years old, all the trouble with them, slightly sun-bleached in parts. Everything else, under the bonnets and the boots, everything is bog standard. I have replaced badges over the years, the trim. Some of the trim's been replaced, just because I'm a bit fussy about it, I just wanted it doing. So basically, the vehicle is just as it came out of the factory, except for the wheels really, and the carburettor and the air filter. Everything else is just bog standard. Obviously, as you can see on this vehicle, there's quite a bit of chrome. Not as much as the older 50s vehicles, but I have replaced quite a lot of the chrome trim. Easy to get, basically. Obviously, all comes from the States. Perhaps not as good as the original product because it may come from the States, but when you see the packaging, it's mainly all made in China or Taiwan. But it fits exact, there's no problem getting things to fit. I have replaced some of the small markers on the backlight, but basically that's all really. It's all I've replaced over there because they're slightly tarnished. Maybe in the future it might need more chrome trimming. It probably does need to get perfect. The bumper's chroming. The front bumper alone requires 3 men to take it off. It's so heavy. Now I'm hoping, I'm still searching to find someone who's got a vat big enough to get it in. And I think I found someone around Manchester who's willing to have a go, and hopefully when the bumpers are done the car will be almost concourse. People don't see many of these vehicles on the road, particularly this shape and all. There's a lot of people just think American cars are the big 70s squared land yachts. Every time I go out in it, there's people with cameras stopping me, or trouble is, one of the scariest things, you're driving down the motorway and people are always taking photographs of you, and you're watching that suddenly, as they're taking photographs, they're suddenly swerving towards you, and you're thinking, I hope they've seen me. But you go to the petrol station, people are out with the cameras taking photographs, it's constantly. So after the first few months of driving a vehicle like this, it's embarrassing because you're driving it and everybody's just constantly staring and papping the horns. But I've had it 6 years now, I've got used to that, you get used to it. Obviously the wife comes to most of the shows and she gets a little bit embarrassed sat in the passenger seat and everybody's pointing at her. But again, we both got used to it now. It's a pleasure. I mean, I think it gives people pleasure. People haven't seen a lot of old American vehicles, but anything from the 40s, 50s and 60s, people in Britain just don't see them.
One of the places where people can see these cars is at some of the numerous classic car shows and meets that take place all over the UK, some of which Brian, of course, attends.
Remember, just after 63, 64, Ford in England decided to make the Ford Corsair, which was a smaller copy of this. You can't help but notice how close the Ford Corsair is resembles this shape. But this shape again, if you notice most American cars, there's no shape like it previous to this and no shape like it later. It's very low for an American car and wide. Most American cars are quite high up in stance, but this sits low to the ground. People say to me, have I lowered the suspension? I said, no, this vehicle came like this. I go to various shows every weekend. I'm in the AACNW club. Approximately got about 800 members, all sorts of vehicles. Lots of old vehicles, 50s, 40s, up to modern Mustangs. Go to shows every weekend, spring to summer. It has won numerous prizes. Up to date in the last 12 months, I think we've acquired 13 trophies. Basically, first or second best American at most shows. I think the reason being it's quite a unique shape. It's fairly reliable, it's like a 50-year-old vehicle. Things happen now and again, but as people say, that's you never get bored with the Ford. That's one of the old sayings, especially the old Fords, but it's never really let me down. I travel hundreds of miles in it, like every weekend for 4 or 5 months. We're out. Travel all over the north, mainly northwest. It gets me there, gets me back. Never no problems. The American car market in Britain at the moment is booming. There's hundreds of clubs. Getting an American vehicle is quite easy. There's plenty of magazines available to source through, or eBay and so forth. Things with American vehicles, they made hundreds and hundreds of shapes, whereas English vehicles, not being funny, what you see a Ford Capri, you'll see a Ford Escort, and they're all the same. You go to a show, but American vehicles are all different shapes and sizes.
American car enthusiasts like to get together and swap stories, as well as poking around each other's cars. In the northwest of England, like-minded petrol heads meet once a month, rain or shine, in the car park of this coffee shop to check out what's new and what's hot. And on any given Sunday morning, you're likely to see an amazing selection of trucks, muscle cars and land yachts from all eras.
People say this particular model, Elvis Presley bought one, but he only had it a few days, and 2 of his roadies at the time drove it, and this model had spoke wheels on it. Kelly Hayes spoke wheels they was called, and the spoke wheels actually shattered and the car almost crashed, so Elvis went back to the Cadillacs again. He only had it for a very short time, one of these. The Thunderbird was an expensive car. I think these vehicles in the day, this particular vehicle would have been $5,500 approximately, which for 1962 was way out of the class of most white collar workers. People who bought a Thunderbird even back in the 50s up until the mid 60s, whereas intellectual people, quite wealthy people.
But even as sales of the Thunderbird were continuing to grow, there was an automotive revolution coming. Brian takes up the story.
Then 64 came along. Ford wanted another market. They realised they designed and produced the popular, famous, most famous, iconic American car was the Mustang for a younger market, a smaller vehicle to suit the European market, cheap to produce. Thousands bought them. I think after probably the 1963, 64, 65, 66, Thunderbirds then slowly started to wane a little, and the Mustang just took over. As we all know, it's still a vast car now. Driving this particular age of American vehicle, obviously early 60s, I just get behind the wheel. Obviously, my era, I put on my 60s music and I just drift back to my youth, which is absolutely brilliant feeling.
Also brilliant is this beautiful Thunderbird. Thanks, Brian, and may you have many more happy memories driving it. Now to our second 1960s car from Henry Ford, the iconic Mustang Fastback, which ushered in a whole new profile into the lexicon of automotive design. But it wasn't the first Mustang, as owner and restorer Derek Noten explains.
The Mustang came out, it was launched on the 17th of April 1964 with a convertible, a hard top, and then in 65 they produced the Fastback. When Ford produced it, there was a lot of controversy about the shape, and they projected to produce 40,000 units in a year. In the end they made 460,000 in the 64-65 year. Ford wanted to be able to produce a car that is for the people, which it's always been. Originally, the prototype to this would have had a 1.7 or 2 litre engine in it, which it just would never have lasted then. The option pack that you got with it, you got the basic car. As you were ordering it, you ticked the boxes. You wanted different brakes, different wheels, different colour, different interior, different size tyres, things like that. And it was the first custom car from being built.
It's hard to believe now that until Mustangs rolled off the line, you had little choice of specification, apart from colour. But let's hear more about this particular car from Derek.
The car, when I bought it, was roadworthy, and I used it for 5 years, and then it was starting to rot, and at the time I purchased a new car and it was put on hold to do.
And so, this beautiful car had a tarpaulin thrown over it and just sat there for a good few years. It was even robbed of some of its parts and glass while in storage until Derek finally got around to restoring it, which, as we'll see, wasn't counted in months or even years, but decades.
From 1991, started collecting parts for it, especially from America. We decided to go for a holiday and see what parts we could get. And in doing that, even from the first time we went, we brought parts back then. They're readily available. A lot of the mechanical components are still available for the normal auto store. In parts, it's had probably 65% of the metal work. The rest of it, steering, suspension, all new, exhaust, brakes, and numerous engine parts. I've done all the welding, all the metal work, all the mechanical work, even down to stripping the engine, rebuilding it, having it machined, all the steering, suspension, interior. I had somebody to paint it, and the headliner was fitted by a professional. The car has had a rebore, crankshaft ground, new performance camshaft. The inlet manifold is a competition type, and a large carburettor, and a lot of chrome. On the engine side now, I would think that it would be around 260 horsepower, which is 35 horsepower more than the standard V8 anyway. I didn't want a race car, so I just wanted something with a little bit more performance for just road use. I like to drive the car.
You can see from the smile on his face that he really does enjoy that. And having been in the passenger seat, we can tell you that it's a great ride. The engine modifications resulting in a tractable car that's equally at home, pootling through traffic or out on the open road. Rattle-free and taut, you can tell that every last nut and bolt is tightened to factory spec. So, in the 90s, when Derek started his restoration, the business of remanufacturing parts for classics was only in its infancy, which even to a time-served mechanic like Derek caused a few problems. Many parts simply weren't available, and especially in the UK, donor cars to take parts from were rare.
When I started the restoration, when I stripped the paint off, originally it was white. It was white primer and it had been sprayed probably 3 times before I got it. It had several bits of damage on it that was repaired, especially in the roof. It was probably done in its early life because it wasn't filler, it was done with lead. When I stripped the vehicle to its shell, then we found out how extent of the floor damage that was rotted. And the only options I had at the time was using repair panels, 4 panels on each side, and then you had to retain the tunnel. So you had to join everything into the tunnel. Now you can buy a complete floor panel, which a professional would do it in a day's work. It took me weeks and weeks, and of grinding, welding, going inside and outside. It was just a lot of awkward work to do. The rear wings were not available. I had to use the rear wing from a convertible, which was a different shape around the top. So there was a lot of fabrication around that. The seats, the carpet, the trim pads came, and I had to repair the seats, strengthen them, and then refurbish them with new covers and all new foams. The foam comes as one pad for the back and one for the seat. They're already moulded. They're very easy to fit, but you've got to use specific fixings for it. You have to use like hog rings, as they call them, to fix it to the body of the seat. Well, I'd never done one before, so I managed it quite easily.
The Mustang's interior is a joy to behold, and although purists will spot a modern entertainment system in the center console, they'll also be relieved to know that no original parts were harmed during this modification. The interior, frankly, looks better than the day the car rolled off the line. Better, as it now sports the luxury Mustang seatbacks and a few other period adornments. After 20-odd years in restoration, Derek's now going to a few car shows with it and gaining some pots as the fruits of his labour.
Shown it limited times, which is probably 6 or 7 times in the last 2 years. On its first time out, it got the Stars and Stripes Best Mustang in 2011, for the first showing. I was very, very surprised as well, because of the amount of competition that was with it.
In the last 20 years, the classic car restoration market has changed beyond all recognition, and now it's perfectly possible to get all sorts of remanufactured parts, from body panels to formerly hard-to-get trim pieces, all of which are manna from heaven for the enthusiastic classic restorer. And because the Mustang is so iconic, and prices for the original first-generation pony car are so strong, a glance at the internet will prove there's a thriving market in classic parts on both sides of the Atlantic.
Now you can actually build a new car. For the 67, you can buy a brand new shell and build a complete new car. And you've got varying qualities of the parts that you buy. As in the wing fender, as it's called, you can purchase one for $120, which is a Malaysian copy, I think it is, or a Canadian wing, or an American wing done on the original press with better materials, whatever quality you need. In the reproduction parts, and has become a massive market because of people want to own these cars and do them. They want to do them themselves, especially. You can make it safer, get better brakes, better suspension.
And of course, more shiny, as Derek's car bears witness to. Basically, there's little you can't add to or modify on a Mustang. Its powertrain so ubiquitous, its mechanics so relatively simple. The sky really is the limit, or perhaps that should be your wallet is the limit. 50 years on, and Mustang fever shows no sign of abating, with major celebrations planned for 2014 and an all-new worldwide model for the 2015 model year, with a choice of 4-pot turbo or iconic V8 power.
For the anniversary of the Mustang in 2014, hopefully I will be in America at the same time. I'd like to get to one of the gatherings that are going to be available. In 2015, they'll have available a right-hand drive one for Europe. Whether it's going to take hold in this country, I don't know. It's been produced for so long, I think it's become part of the heritage. I'm sure of it. Everybody knows about a Mustang. I think it's getting better in appreciation by even young people, even children now. They look at it and they say, wow, look at that car.
And so they should. No one can fail to notice the dedication that Derek's put into this project as he drives through South Manchester on a blustery autumn day. The number of people who turn to look is amazing. Derek's pretty happy with it, we know, and now it's finished, even better than he thought it would be by his own admission, he's got some pretty strong ideas about classic cars and those people who just buy them as investments and never drive them.
If the car's put in a museum, it's generally a piece of art because people want to see them, but I think they're a waste. You need to drive them. It's going to go to my son. I've always promised it my son. I couldn't sell it. He would have to sell it. I drive the car with the windows down, just enjoy driving it, and people just notice it. They take a lot of notice of it. My son stopped at the traffic lights and a guy with a new XK8 convertible asked him if he would sell the car to him. He said, I prefer that one to the one I've got. Being involved in the 60s, I was in my teens, great good times. The classic cars that we've got now, that were all iconic things at the time. It was progress. It gives a thrill to drive. It's good on the eye, and I just like driving it.
The 1965 Mustang Fastback. If ever there was an iconic US classic, this has got to be it.